They thought she was just another woman walking her dog on a logging road in the middle of nowhere. That was their first mistake. The trail cut through the backwoods outside of Kamloops, British Columbia, the kind of road that showed up on maps, but not in anyone's GPS, flanked by old-growth Douglas fir, and the kind of silence that only exists when you're truly far from everything. It was a Tuesday in late October, and the light came down through the canopy in thin, pale shafts that barely touched the ground. The air smelled like wet earth and pine resin and the particular cold that comes before the first snow. Claire Devereux walked the trail the way she always did. Steady, unhurried, her eyes moving without her head turning. Beside her, padding on silent paws, was Kodiak. Not the Kodiak in the names file, a different one entirely. A Belgian Malinois with a scar running from his left shoulder to his ribs, fur the color of tarnished copper, and eyes that were almost too intelligent to belong to an animal. He moved the way Claire moved, loose, watchful, conserving every ounce of energy until the moment it needed to be spent. Claire was 29 years old. She had a small scar under her left eyebrow from a training exercise that went sideways in Wainwright. She had a storage unit in Kelowna with 3 boxes in it and nothing else. She had a lease on a cabin 15 minutes from where she was currently walking, and she had Kodiak, and for the last 14 months, that had been enough. She'd been discharged honorably from Joint Task Force 2, Canada's Tier 1 Special Operations Unit, 8 months before her contract was up. The official reason was medical. The real reason was the kind of thing that didn't get written into files. She didn't talk about it. Neither did the people who'd been there. She wasn't carrying anything visible. No pack, no poles, just worn-in Salomon trail runners, dark cargo pants, a grey fleece that had seen better years, and a braid pulled tight enough to stay put. She looked like any other woman out for a long walk in the backcountry. She looked like someone you could ignore. The truck appeared behind her before she heard it. That told her something right away. They'd cut the engine and let it roll, which meant they'd been watching her for at least a few minutes before they decided to make themselves known. She didn't turn around. She kept walking. Beside her, Kodiak's head dropped 2 inches, his stride shortening. He'd heard it longer before she had. He always did. The truck doors opened. 3 of them. She counted the footfalls without looking. 2 coming up on her right, 1 hanging back by the vehicle. The one hanging back was the most dangerous. Always the one hanging back. "Hey!" The voice came from about 8 meters behind her. Male, mid-30s, the particular aggression of someone who'd rehearsed this in his head and was committed now that he'd started. "Hey, I'm talking to you." Claire stopped walking. She didn't turn around yet. Kodiak stopped with her. "Nice dog." This from the second voice, closer, coming around on her left. A flanking move that probably felt clever to him. "Big. What is he, a shepherd?" "Malinois," she said. Her voice was flat. Not scared. Not friendly. Just a word. She turned around. The one who'd spoken first was tall, thick through the shoulders, wearing a Carhartt jacket over a flannel shirt. He had a tire iron in his right hand, held loose against his leg like he'd already decided he wasn't going to need it, but wanted the option. His name, though she didn't know it then, was Garrett. Garrett Pruitt, 41, 3 priors in BC and 1 in Alberta, currently on conditions he was violating just by being outside of Kamloops. The second man was shorter, wiry, with the kind of restless energy that came from too much of something he probably shouldn't have been taking. He was already moving around to her left, trying to create an angle. His eyes kept going to Kodiak, and then away, the way people do when something makes them nervous, but they don't want to admit it. The third man, the one by the truck, hadn't moved. He was leaning against the hood with his arms crossed, watching, older than the other 2 by a decade at least. That one had done this before, the wiry one said. He reached a hand toward Kodiak. Kodiak didn't move, didn't growl, just looked at the hand with those amber eyes, utterly still. "I wouldn't," Claire said. "He bite, only when I tell him to." The big one, Garrett, took a step toward her. "See, here's the thing. We've been watching this trail for a couple days now. This whole area's kind of ours, you understand, and we don't really like people wandering around back here." Claire looked at him. "Not at the tire iron, at him. I'm just taking my dog for a walk," she said. "Yeah, well." Garrett lifted the tire iron an inch off his thigh, not pointing it at her, just reminding her it existed. "This isn't the place for that." She held his gaze for a moment, long enough that it became uncomfortable for him, which was the point, and then she said, very clearly, very calmly, "I'm going to ask you once to step back and let me walk past. After that, I'm not asking anymore." The wiry one laughed. Garrett's jaw tightened. He took another step toward her. What happened next happened very fast. The wiry one made a lunge for Kodiak. Not a careful reach, a grab, the kind of move that telegraphed itself 3 steps before it landed. Claire had already seen it coming. Kodiak had already seen it coming. She said the word, one word, low and sharp in Dutch, because that's how he'd been trained, and Kodiak moved. He didn't bark. He didn't posture. He simply closed the distance between himself and the wiry man in 2 strides, and put him on the ground with the clean efficiency of something that has been trained to do exactly this and has done it many times before. The wiry man's shout died in his throat the moment Kodiak's weight hit him. Garrett swung the tire iron. Claire stepped inside it. This is the thing about a tire iron, or a bat, or any long rigid weapon swung by someone who isn't trained. It's a commitment. The moment the swing starts, the wielder's entire upper body is dedicated to it. There's a window, narrow and specific, between the initiation and the contact, and inside that window the person holding the weapon is completely open. Claire had been trained to see that window. She'd been trained to walk through it. She caught his forearm with both hands on the way through, redirected the kinetic energy of the swing into a rotation she controlled, and used it to put Garrett's own momentum against him. He hit the gravel face first with enough force to knock the tire iron loose. She had his arm torqued behind him before he'd processed what had happened, her knee in the small of his back, her voice absolutely level when she said, "Stay down." He stayed down. The third man by the truck had pushed off the hood. He had something in his hand now, not a phone. She clocked it in her peripheral vision and felt the situation shift register entirely, the way it does when what started as intimidation crosses into something that requires a different calculation. She didn't have a weapon. She had Kodiak, who was still occupied. She had 12 feet of open gravel between her and the man by the truck, and she had the particular stillness that had settled into her body somewhere between Wainwright and a village in a country she wasn't allowed to name. "Release," she said to Kodiak. He released. She didn't take her knee off Garrett's back, but she angled herself so she could see the third man clearly. He'd stopped moving. He was looking at the wiry one, still on the ground, breathing, not badly hurt but shaken, and at Garrett pinned under someone who looked like she'd wandered out of an REI catalogue, and something was happening in his expression. A recalculation. The kind that comes when the math stops working. "Here's where we are," Claire said. Her voice hadn't risen once. "Your friend on the left is going to be fine. A little embarrassed, few bruises. Your friend under me is going to have a sore shoulder for a week, and you still have a choice to make." The third man said nothing. "Whatever you brought this out here to do," she continued, "this isn't how that ends. You want to walk away, this is the moment." He looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at the thing in his hand. He set it on the hood of the truck. He said, "What are you?" Claire looked at him steadily. Someone who was just taking her dog for a walk. She let Garrett up slowly and stepped back, keeping herself between him and Kodiak and the third man and the truck, a geometry she was tracking automatically without conscious effort. The wiry one had gotten to his feet, holding his forearm, not meeting her eyes. Garrett was working his jaw, looking at the gravel, the particular silence of someone recalibrating their entire model of a situation. The third man hadn't moved from the truck. She'd been doing risk calculations since the moment she heard the engine cut out, But something about the third man nagged at her now in a way that hadn't resolved when she'd disarmed the immediate situation. He'd hung back too deliberately. He'd watched too carefully. The other two had come forward because that's what the other two did. She could read that story in their bodies, in the way they moved, the posturing, the rehearsed aggression. It was opportunistic, territorial. But the third man had watched. That was a different skill set. She glanced at Kodiak. He was standing easy now, weight-balanced, eyes on the third man. His ears had done something she'd learned to trust over 4 years of partnership, a half-rotation toward the tree line to their east. She didn't look at the tree line, not yet. "You need to leave now," she said. She said it to all three of them, but she was watching the third man. Garrett spat blood onto the gravel. He'd bitten the inside of his cheek on the way down, and gave her one long look that was trying to be menacing and wasn't. The wiry one was already moving back toward the truck. Whatever had seemed like a good idea an hour ago had evaporated entirely. The third man picked the object up from the hood, not pointing it at her, just pocketing it. "This trail," he said quietly, "is going to be a lot busier soon." He said it without heat, without menace, the way someone states a fact. Then he got in the truck. Garrett got in. The wiry one got in. The engine started, and the truck reversed down the logging road. And then it was gone, and the only sounds were the wind through the Douglas fir, and Kodiak's breathing, and Claire's own heartbeat, which had climbed exactly as high as it needed to, and no higher. She stood in the middle of the road for a moment. This trail is going to be a lot busier soon. That wasn't a threat about coming back. She'd heard threats. She knew what they sounded like. This was something else, the offhand information of someone who already knew something she didn't. She looked east. Kodiak was still watching the tree line. "Find," she said softly. He moved into the underbrush without a sound. She found had the cache 30 meters off the trail under a section of deadfall that had been there long enough to look natural but had been placed there recently. She could tell by the ground compression. The deadfall was dry. The earth beneath it still held moisture that the surrounding soil had long since lost. Someone had moved it within the last 72 hours. It was a hard case, aviation style, the kind used for sensitive equipment. Padlocked, roughly 60 centimeters long. She didn't open it. She sat back on her heels in the damp undergrowth and looked at it for a moment and thought about the third man's eyes and the way he'd watched the trail and the specific phrasing. Going to be a lot busier. Future tense. Something was coming to this trail, or through it, and whatever it was, someone had pre-positioned a case in the woods 60 meters off a logging road 3 days in advance. She took out her phone. No signal. She was too far into the valley. She photographed the case from 4 angles without moving it, photographed the ground around it, photographed the deadfall placement. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket. She still used paper for some things, an old habit, and wrote down the GPS coordinates from the phone's offline map function. Then she stood up, called Kodiak back to her side, and walked back to the trail. She didn't touch the case. She didn't leave any sign she'd been there. She walked out the same way she'd walked in, at the same pace, and she thought about what she was going to do with what she knew. The problem with leaving JTF2 the way she had, quietly, early, with a medical file that covered the real reasons, was that the exit had been clean in the official sense and not clean in the human sense. She still knew people. The people she knew still trusted her, and the relationship between what the government knew about her and what her former colleagues knew about her was a gap that had occasionally proven useful. Her name wasn't in any database that the average law enforcement computer could find. Her training absolutely was. She drove to Kamloops proper, found signal outside a Tim Hortons on the Trans-Canada, and made 1 phone call. 3 rings, then a pickup, then silence that meant go ahead. "I need a read on activity in the Lac du Bois corridor," she said. "Logging road access, east face, and I need to know if anyone has a watch on a cache site in that grid." The voice on the other end said, Give me the coordinates, she gave them. 48 hours, the voice said. I don't think we have 48 hours. A pause. 12, she said. Fine. She bought a coffee she didn't particularly want and sat in the parking lot and watched the traffic on the Trans-Canada and let Kodiak have water from the bottle she kept behind the seat. He drank without urgency, then put his chin on her shoulder and breathed warm air against the side of her neck. Yeah, she said to him. Me too. The call came back in 9 hours, not 12. She'd gone back to the cabin. She'd eaten. She'd done an hour of movement in the clearing behind the house. Not exercise exactly, more like maintenance, the way you check the tension on a wire to make sure it's still right. Kodiak had slept in his usual position, door-facing, one eye half open. When the phone rang, she picked up on the first ring. Your cache site is in a corridor that RCMP has had flagged for 6 months, the voice said. Suspected transfer route for stolen ordnance out of a CFB Suffield break-in. We lost the trail in Manitoba. Looks like it came west. She was quiet for a moment. The men on the trail today. We're running the truck now. Preliminary reads like hired logistics. Not the principal. There's a principal, she said. Third man. Older. He was directing. Description? She gave it. Height, build, the particular way he'd carried himself, the specific weight of the pause before he spoke. The voice took notes she couldn't hear. The cache is pre-positioned, she said. Transfer is coming. Soon, that's what he told me, even if he didn't know he was telling me, we need eyes on that trail. There was a silence. Claire. She looked out the window at the dark tree line above the cabin. Kodiak had lifted his head. I know, she said. You don't have to. I know. Another silence. You have current equipment, the voice asked. She thought about the locked trunk in the back of the closet. I'm not currently serving. That's not what I asked. She almost smiled. Yeah, she said. I have current equipment. She was back on the logging road before 4 in the morning. The temperature had dropped overnight, and there was a thin rime of frost on the gravel, which she was careful not to disturb as she moved east of the trail into the same tree line where the cache sat. She'd changed from the previous day. Dark layers, nothing that caught light, her hair down now and tucked under a balaclava she'd pushed up to her forehead. She moved through the undergrowth the way Kodiak moved, without commitment to any single footfall until she was sure of the ground. She wasn't alone this time, technically. There were 2 RCMP tactical units staged 12 kilometers down the highway, waiting on her signal, but they needed the transfer in progress. They needed the principles, not just the logistics chain, which meant she needed to be here first, and she needed to wait, and she needed not to move when things started happening. She was good at not moving. Kodiak settled into the underbrush beside her, pressed along the length of her left side, warm and utterly still. She could feel his ribs expanding and contracting in a slow rhythm that matched her own breathing. That had started some time in their 2nd year together, this synchronization, and she'd never tried to explain it to anyone, because there was no explanation that didn't sound like something from a book someone would give you as a gift and you'd never actually read. She heard the first vehicle at 5:47, not from the logging road, from the north, a different access point she hadn't clocked because it was barely visible on any map, a cut made by forestry equipment years ago and long since grown over. They'd done reconnaissance, of course they had. 2 vehicles, she could hear the difference. She pressed lower. There were 5 of them. Not Garrett and the other 2. These were different people, moving differently, organized in a way that indicated training. She watched them through the undergrowth as they collected the case, as a 6th figure, someone she hadn't seen arrive, who'd been waiting deeper in the tree line, directed the operation in murmured instructions that carried no further than 3 meters in the cold morning air. The 6th figure. He was the one she needed. She had eyes on him for 90 seconds before she recognized the posture, the set of the shoulders, the deliberate economy of movement. She'd been in rooms with this person. She'd been in briefings with this person. The recognition arrived not in a thought but in her body, a cold specificity that was different from the alertness of the last 12 hours, because this was personal in a way the rest hadn't been. His name was Warren Spetch. He'd been a senior intelligence analyst with CSIS. He'd had clearances she'd known about, and clearances she'd never been told about. And he'd been retired. That word again, that useful word, 18 months ago, under circumstances that had been described to her as a mutual agreement. She understood now that the mutual agreement had been somewhat one-sided. She sent the signal. 2 taps, encrypted burst, received by the units on the highway as principals on site, transfer in progress, move. Then she waited. The RCMP tactical teams came in from both access points simultaneously, which is the kind of coordination that takes months of planning when you're doing it from scratch, and about 40 minutes when you're redirecting assets that are already staged and waiting. She heard them before she saw them, the particular sound of organized movement through underbrush, distinct from the irregular noise of people moving who don't know what they're doing. Spetch heard them too. For a fraction of a second, she saw him look toward the tree line to the south. The logging roadside, the direction that made tactical sense if you were trying to run. She saw him calculate it. She saw the calculation complete. She stepped out of the underbrush. She was directly between him and the trail. He looked at her. She looked at him. The tactical teams arrived. The 5 logistics people went down to the ground without much resistance. They were logistics. They weren't paid to take bullets for the principal, and they were smart enough to know what was happening. The case was secured. The scene contracted into the controlled chaos of a professional arrest operation. Spetch still hadn't moved. "Claire," he said. He said her name the way people say it when they know they're done and have decided to be calm about it. "Warren," she said. He looked at Kodiak, who was standing at her left knee, facing him with those amber eyes. "You were just taking your dog for a walk," he said. She held his gaze. "That's right." He almost smiled. There was something in it that she didn't like. Not regret exactly, more like the satisfaction of someone who'd played a long game and found it interesting, even at the end. "You know this isn't the whole picture, I know. There are people further up. Who?" "I know that too," she said. "You can tell them to the people you're about to meet." He looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at the RCMP officer approaching from his left and the one approaching from his right, and he made the smart choice and put his hands where they could see them. She gave her statement in the parking lot of a closed gas station on the highway. Standing in the grey morning light with a blanket someone had handed her that she didn't need but accepted, because refusing things people offer you from kindness takes more energy than accepting them. An RCMP sergeant named Beaumont handled most of it. Patient, professional, clearly exhausted, clearly used to exhausted. He asked good questions. She gave him accurate answers that covered everything she was authorized to cover, which was most of it. When they were done, he looked at her for a moment. "How'd you know Spetch was going to be there?" he asked. Not accusatory, genuinely curious. "I didn't," she said. "I knew someone was directing the operation. He was the someone, and you recognized him." "I recognized him." Beaumont nodded slowly. He looked at Kodiak, who was sitting beside her in the gravel, looking at nothing in particular. "That's a hell of a dog," he said. "He is," she agreed. She drove home as the sun came up over the eastern ridge, painting the frost on the logging roads, gold and then white and then gone. Kodiak was asleep in the back seat before she hit the first junction, his chin on his forepaws, his breathing slow. She drove with the window down 2 inches. The air smelled like frozen pine and coming winter, and the specific clarity of a morning after something has resolved that needed resolving. She thought about Warren Spetch's last words in the tree line. There are people further up. There always were. That was the thing about this kind of work. It was never one case, one operation, one cache in the woods. It was a thread that led to another thread, and you pulled on the one in front of you because that was what you could reach, and you didn't let yourself think too hard about how many threads were still out there. She turned onto the road that led to the cabin. She thought about the third man from yesterday, Garrett's handler, Spetch's logistics coordinator. He'd told her, without meaning to, that something was coming. He'd looked at her and seen a woman with a dog, and he'd decided she was irrelevant enough to be honest around. She thought about all the times in her life that someone had made exactly that assessment. She had never, not once, taken it personally. The cabin came into view through the trees. The frost on the roof was still intact, undisturbed, which meant no one had been near it while she was gone. She let herself breathe a little more freely. She parked. She got out. Kodiak was awake instantly, dropping from the back seat to the gravel and stretching in the particular full-body way that Malinois stretch, spine-arching, paws spread, a small sound that was somewhere between a yawn and a comment. She looked at him, he looked at her. "I know," she said. "Breakfast first." She unlocked the cabin door and they went inside, and the door closed behind them, and the trail through the backwoods outside of Kamloops was quiet again, the frost on the gravel catching the early light and the trees standing exactly as they always had, patient, enormous, keeping whatever else they'd witnessed to themselves.